With that, we are, man, I cannot tell you, last week I said I was excited. This week I'm saying even more so I'm excited. Last week we started our series for this month, our Christmas series called A Voice of Hope. And so what we're doing is we're looking back before the Christmas story, and we're looking at these guys who lived 500, 600, 700 years before Christ was even on this earth. And we're looking at what they were saying about this guy who's to come. And so this week we are in another one of our favorite books, I know. We're in the book of Jeremiah. And so let's look at the screen real quick and let's see where we're going. So it says this: "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell securely, and this is the name by which it will be called: the Lord is our righteousness." A mentor of mine, he once said, Why is it that the season for the Prince of Peace happens to be one of the most stressful times of year? You ever wonder about that? Why is it that the season where we're celebrating the Prince of Peace ends up being one of the most stressful times of the year? I mean, anybody kind of feel that way? Like Christmas is supposed to be jolly and great, and it's supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year, right? But yet, sometimes there's this tinge of like annoyance, or there's this tinge of like I wonder what the bank account's going to suffer this year, or man, I got to go see those people, or maybe it just brings up memories, and we're left. And I've always kind of had this issue with the song, "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year." And for example, here's a line: is that what happens when joy and happiness when loved ones are near? Well, what happens if family or relationships really spring up some really dirt kind of in our hearts when it comes to this time of year? When loved ones come around, is it joy that shouts through our veins, or is it kind of this just, or is it this heartbreak? Or here's another one where there'll be much mistletoeing, but what about those who this is going to be their first Christmas without a spouse, or they just went through a nasty breakup, or they're experiencing divorce, and now family just looks completely different? What about that? And this Christmas season just becomes a reminder of what love once was. And hearts will be glowing, but what happens if those hearts are actually burdened by just all the stresses going on day in and day out? Or why is it that therapy appointments go to an all-time high at Christmas season? Like, this is why I have an issue with this song. And this is the point where somebody kind of takes me aside and says, like, "Spence, come on, man, it's Christmas. Like, people, we don't need that right now, right? Like, it's this time where all should be cheery and happy, and Christmas is..." But here's the truth behind it, is why do we continue to buy into these cheap things day in or year in and year out, when Christmas is actually one of the most idolatrous times in the American season when it comes to the perspective of Christianity? I mean, we give ourselves to absolutely everything, and we hide behind this idea that this time of cheerfulness is supposed to just make everything go away, and it's this time where we don't have to actually focus on the real stuff that's happening, and we can hide behind this Christmas stuff. And it's interesting. Now, I don't really have that big of an issue with Christmas, but there is a lot of truth behind that. And for some of us, it would be this time of, okay, like, why don't we just keep the spirits up? Why reveal that kind of stuff? Because Christmas it's that time where we can look forward to something, because we know everything else that's going on here. But the issue with that is the truth behind it will always be there. And it's interesting because about this time, not Christmas time, but kind of what was going on in the time that we're talking about with Jeremiah, you would start to hear some similar kind of language. You see, the prophets were these people who were chosen by God and commissioned by God to go be his mouthpiece for the nation of Israel, both in the northern kingdom of Israel and in the southern kingdom of Judah. And so their whole deal is something that if you were in Jerusalem or you're around the land and you're around a prophet, you would start hearing kind of phrases like this, is somebody would go up maybe to the kings in Jerusalem, and they would say, "Kings, you have become drunk on your power. People in Israel, you're not actually following God. You're not actually giving your allegiance and your love and your joy to God. Look what you're doing in life. You're idolizing inanimate material objects instead of God of the universe. You're just doing whatever you want to fill your own life. You sinners, and God is our God, bringing consequences because you've chosen to just completely throw him to the dirt and do whatever it is you want to do." And the same kind of thing would happen. Hey, come on, like Jeremiah or somebody, like, you're killing the mood here, right? Like, we don't actually want to hear that. We don't actually want to hear the things. And so one of the things that Jeremiah will actually be thrown in prison because the kings, people, they don't want to hear that stuff. They want to keep going and doing, but there's something interesting is that when the truth is spoken, it has to be dealt with. When the things underneath the fluff come into the light, it has to be dealt with. And so when we take our minds outside and we take our minds to the place where, we can fill our lives with the things. Christmas time is one of those beautiful blankets that we can just cover and say, it's Christmas. But we all realize that life isn't actually like the songs that we hear around it. Actually, there's hardly any Jesus when it comes to a lot of stuff. And so when we look at our world, we actually see that not all is cheery and not all is bright and loving and warm. It's actually pretty dang dark. And so when we get past all the fluff and we see the truth for what it is, it kind of just leaves us in this spot of like, oh. And this is the same thing with the prophets. The truth comes out and then everybody's just kind of like, But there's this beautiful thing, and it's why we're talking about it, because always with coming of the prophets, there's a message of truth that when we hear the truth, we have to accept and deal with it. But also, there's a voice of hope, and so that's what this series is called. And what we just read and what we're diving into is that there is a lot coming for Jerusalem right now. A lot. And God's bringing consequences of what it means to for 400 years for people to completely keep disowning him and disowning God. And so God says, hey, because of this, there's going to be consequences. You've got to have your mind snapped back into place. You have to see that what you do without me actually brings consequences. But there's a message of hope. That God is still God and Israel is still his people and he will still care and love even after the consequences. And so what we just read is there's this small little moment in Jeremiah after he gets past here's what's coming. You've got a people who's coming about to take out our city, but this is who our God is, so don't worry. So we did this last week. The prophets, very, very hard. I know sometimes when you read them, you're just kind of like that. I just got like 3 different analogies for why an antelope is like the nation of Judah. And you're just like, what? I don't know what to do with this. So real quick, we did this last week, kind of give some context of going on. So real quick, got 3, just give me 3 minutes. We're going to hop into the classroom real quick, learn some stuff, because we have to know what's going on in order for us to make sense of what's happening here. So let's go into the classroom. Here we go. So behind me, there's this timeline. So last week, we saw where Isaiah was in this whole thing. So we've got 2 markers. One, King David starts off the whole king's biggest king ever was in Israel. Great. So he's our waypoint. Everybody kind of knows him. So then we've got this point around the 580s area is where the kings come to an end and Babylon comes in and finally just wipes Jerusalem. And God's like, hey, we're just going to do a quick restart. You're going to go over there for a little bit and come back. So Jeremiah is right here. He's towards the tail end of everything. And what he's going to be prophesying is right in the midst of it. He's like, hey, Isaiah was over here, and he was like, hey, someday this is going to happen. Jeremiah's like, yo, they're on our doorstep. Get ready. And so everyone's like, ah. And so Jeremiah will actually prophesy about it, experience it, and then prophesy in it. So it's kind of cool. He starts right there at the end, but then he kind of goes into the fall and then just a touch bit after. So it's really cool. I highly recommend diving into his book. So second thing is, here's a map of Israel. So we saw last week that the map of Israel, so there is the map of, Jacob, help me out here. Should be there. Do you have the map of Babylon? Really? Oh, that breaks my heart. I swear I put it in this morning. So picture Israel right here, right? Okay, so you have northern Israel. Northern Israel's gone. Judah's left. So Babylon, you've got Babylon who's all the way over here. They're coming up and down. So Babylon takes over. So last week we learned Isaiah was worried about the Assyrian Empire. Well, the Assyrians are no more. Babylon took over, and they're now the world power. And Jerusalem is like, hey, we're not going to do anything with you, Babylon. We're going to go back down to Egypt, and we're going to form an alliance, and we're still going to be mighty. And Babylon's like, nah, fam. And so they're going to come over and just completely wipe out. And so God's going to pronounce this judgment because you've turned against me, because you've just left me in the dirt, because you feel that I'm not supportive enough or that I'm not big or good enough to hey, I told you it was here. Okay, look at that. So, yeah, you got that. Flip the Babylon map real quick. Okay, so Babylon's over here, Jerusalem's over here. This is their empire. They're coming, woo, boom, and then they're going to take the people all the way back here. Great, all right, we did it. I told you I'm not a liar. Oh, that's good. So, last bit of evidence. So that's geographically what's happening. Last bit of things is there's this point between Jeremiah 29 through 33 where Jeremiah is going to be telling the people, hey, this is what's coming, but here's some hope. There is a bright side to all this. And so he's going to start telling the people that God is actually not going to just leave them alone. Sure, there's consequences for just completely disowning God and thinking that they can do whatever they want and that they're mighty enough to live and to rule a nation themselves. But God is saying, hey, have I not done all these things? But after that, what's going to happen is that God is going to send this person. And we saw a little glimpse of that in the couple verses that we're going to dive into this morning. But God is going to not leave them, but he's going to bring them back to the nation, to Jerusalem, to Zion, and he's going to establish this person, this king who's going to come, and all will be great and all will be bright again. So there will be chaos, there will be consequence, but there's also hope. So let's jump in. So the first thing that we saw is that the Lord is going to save Israel. He's going to fulfill his promises to Israel and Judah. And the first thing that is going to happen is that there's this branch. This branch of David is going to come forth. So, in order to understand what we got here, we have to go back to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 7 says this. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish him on the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod welded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from you before. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So what's happening here? So there's this promise. God says in Jeremiah, I'm going to fulfill my promise to you guys. Don't you worry. And so he gives this promise to King David that always, from you all the way on, in Jerusalem, one of your biological offspring will be king. And this is a promise that I will hold always. And so we see that as David wants to build this temple for God, God's like, hey, you're not going to be the one. But here's what's going to happen. Your son will build my house in Jerusalem, and I will bless his line and your line, and always you will have a king in Israel or in Jerusalem. And the significance of this statement is pretty dang profound. Like a promise that the God of generations will keep this one generation, this one line, consistently through the kingship of Judah. Now, who was David? Who was David and why him? Because this is also important. So when Israel first wanted a king, And they tell God, hey, or they tell Samuel, hey, we want a king. And God's like, hey, am I not your king? And they're like, yeah, but like everybody else around us has a king. We want a king too. So God says, all right, fine, I'll give you guys a king. And so this guy Saul comes up. And Saul was a great king. But then all of a sudden, Saul's pride started to turn him away from God. And he started to feel, hey, I'm a little more mighty. I can do this thing. And so God's like, hey, Saul, we're going to cut your kingdom off. And then God's looking for a new king. And so he tells Samuel this one thing. I need somebody who's actually going to desire me. I need somebody who's going to chase me. And so what's the criteria for the next king? Well, 1 Samuel says this, but now your kingdom shall not continue. This is to Saul. But now your kingdom is not going to continue, Saul. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. And the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Now, David does literally exactly this. He is a man after God's own heart. And the funny thing, the really cool aspect of this is there's this one line in there where it's like, not only is David a man after God's heart, but God does this thing with David where it says that every single thing that David did, he succeeded. That the power of God came on David, and everything he did, he succeeded. And so why was David so pivotal in this line? Why? Well, there was this neighboring group of people called the Philistines, and they were always at odds with Israel, always at war. And so one of the things that David was, he was put in charge of the military, if you remember the story of David and Goliath. David is this young boy who ends up becoming savior of Israel, who ends up becoming also the greatest military leader Israel's ever known. There's one point where the armies of Israel get back into Jerusalem, and they just got done defeating the Philistines, and the people are crying out as King Saul enters in. They're like, Saul, this guy has killed thousands. Praise Saul, he's savior. But then David walks into the city, and they're like, but David, he's killed tens of thousands. And you see the story keep playing over and over again, that everything David does, he succeeds. And so people know him from history, that David, greatest military leader, made Israel the highest it's ever been in its payday. Him and his son Solomon, I mean, that was just the golden period of the kingdom of Israel. And so then you get back to Jeremiah's prophecy, that I'm going to fulfill my promise to you. I'm going to bring you back, and I am going to lead you. And from that, I will bring up a king, somebody who is this branch of David. Now, in everybody's minds, what's the first thing they're thinking about when they think of David? We were in our heyday when David was in charge, and so that's what's going to happen again, especially in this time. Big bad Babylon's coming over, but don't worry, God's going to raise up a king, and Babylon's not even going to be able to stand up to him. And then the later nations are going to start following in suit. Not even Babylon. The Persians won't stand up to us. Don't worry, because God's going to raise up a king. Or the Greeks, they won't. And then finally, Rome. Rome won't even be able to stand up when God's king comes into play. And so we have to know that this is kind of what's going on in the atmosphere when we listen to this and we think about, okay, what's actually going on when we hear what the significance of this branch of David actually is. And here's the funny part. That big military king, he's about to come riding in. He's going to save the world. And then there's this group of people. First, it's some farmers, some little shepherds. They're doing their thing. And then it's this group of scientists. Well, the wise men, if we want to stick to the Christmas story. This group of scientists, the wise men, they'll come in. And then later, these 12 random guys, just fishermen, like carpenters, woodworkers, those are the same thing, rock workers, they're going to acknowledge that this one guy, this one random dude who shows up to the scene, who comes out of northern backwoods Nazareth, they're going to be crazy enough to say that this guy is the root of David. That Jesus of Nazareth, this nobody, not a glorious king, not a powerful military leader, this guy is actually who the prophets are talking about. I mean, think about how mind-blowing that is. That's like saying, okay, like say somebody comes in and attacks America. And we're like, who's gonna rise up and say to us? And like somebody from like backwoods West Virginia comes up and he's like, I'm gonna do it. And then we're all like, really? Like him? This is how monumental the difference is. Everything that they think of when they think of the root of David is everything Jesus is not. But yet some people are crazy enough to think that this guy actually is the one who the prophets are saying. So what is this branch of David going to actually do? Well, Jeremiah says that he's going to execute justice and righteousness. He's going to execute justice and righteousness. And this is kind of the crux of where we're landing this morning, is that when we hear the word justice, in our 21st century American brains, when we hear the word justice, oftentimes we think of this thing called retributive justice, that there is some kind of penalty for your mistakes, or there's some kind of consequence for things that you might do. If somebody were to kill somebody, then we think of it as, okay, they need to be punished according to the crime that they did. Or if somebody steals something, you get what I'm saying here. When we think of justice, we think of somebody who's suffering some kind of consequence that is according to their actions. And we take this into a biblical sense, and then we kind of immediately go to like the last little bits. And then what our society knows of is like, great, retributive justice, you're going to get what you deserve kind of thing. And then finally, we take that into a biblical context, and then our whole culture is just all up on this thing where it's like, all right, well, if you do good things and then you love God, well, then you get to go to the happy place. And then if you kind of not do good things and you're a bad person and you don't like God, well, then you're going to hell. And so we get into this one little like spot where it's like that's the only kind of justice we see. And while our society really resonates that, and the Old Testament law, right, we have laws. They have places where it's like, hey, if you do these things, you've got to face consequences, right? Like if you steal your neighbor's goat, then you're going to have to either give that back. But here's some stipulations. Here's the fun part about the law. If the goat dies when it's like 8 steps going on to after you stole it, well, then there's a different consequence. And then you have to evaluate the price and the point where it's like, okay, well, the goat walked this amount of miles, and then it's depreciated, and so the value of the goat isn't actually what this is. And so then you have to renegotiate this. And so it's just, the law is just this massive jumbled mess. But it's really funny because our society really is based on this whole thing, and it's something I like to call Batman justice, right? You get what you deserve, and there's a penalty for everything. But there's a couple places in the Bible where this doesn't really match up. Let's take the story of Job, for example. Job is this guy who you see in the very beginning of his story that there's this heavenly meeting, and God's like, hey, there's this dude, Job. He's great. I love him. I myself, as God, am saying, Job's great. He's my guy. And then there's this other guy who walks in, who's the Satan, the accuser we know as Satan. And he's like, hey, I bet you if I took everything away from Job, he wouldn't worship you anymore. And God's like, go, do it. And so Job's life becomes this just miserable circumstance of events that just continue all the way on. And then at the very end of the story, God and Job have this like gigantic moment where God comes in the form of a storm cloud, and he's like, Job, here's everything that's going on. This is why we did everything, and you passed the test, don't worry. But if you read the story, that's not actually what happens. There is no explanation. God gives zero explanation for this little scene we saw of Satan saying, hey, I can do this to Job. Job's saying, who are you, God? And then God comes in and says, who are you, Job? And you see this weird thing where it's like, Job did nothing wrong. He was God's guy, but yet all this stuff happened. And at the very end of the story, we're left with this one thing where it's like, there's no explanation. There's no nothing. Job never understands why any of this happened, but it says that Job lived in peace for the rest of his life because God came in and showed up who he was. There's no law. There's no justice in that. Let's talk about Jesus for a second. Jesus broke the rules, right? He was confronted by the Pharisees multiple times. They picked grain on the Sabbath. He healed on the Sabbath. He did the things according to the law that the Pharisees were like, yo, you can't do those things. But yet Jesus understood something. He understood that there was something bigger at play, that there's actually something different, something that the law actually wasn't showing. And not that the law was just wrong in any means, but the way people interpreted and the way people saw actual justice to Jesus was not the right way. To Jesus, it was something different. And so Jeremiah says that in those days, the branch of David, he will execute justice and righteousness, and Jerusalem and Judah will be saved. Now, wait a second. If Israel is breaking the law, and Israel's breaking the whole code, and they've turned their backs on God, okay, we get the justice and righteousness thing, but like, then it says that one line, when the branch of David executes justice and righteousness, then Jerusalem and Judah will be saved. Do you see what's not adding up there? When he executes justice and righteousness, in this punishment for Israel disassociating themselves with God, they'll be saved. Interesting. Here's another point where this idea of justice doesn't actually line up. It should say, when he executes justice and righteousness, everybody will be punished according to what they've done. And then there will be this kind of like, all right, we'll see what happens next kind of thing. We'll see if you get back on good behavior. We'll see. No. They'll be saved. Jesus, if he is this branch of David, talks about this kind of saving action again. Jesus was under the exact same circumstances, right? Rome's coming in. They've taken over everything. If people are claiming that Jesus is the root of David, that he is going to execute justice and righteousness, and Jerusalem will be saved. Same exact message, same exact circumstances. And yet, we see Jesus is here to save. He is here to be a king. That's going on. And in John 3, when he's talking to the Pharisee Nicodemus, what does Jesus actually say? Is that the Son of Man did not come into the world to what? To condemn it. He came into the world to save it. And so when we talk about justice and righteousness in the Bible, there's something different at play here than we actually think there is. It's not this clear, beautiful black and white, hey, if you do bad things, this is what happens. If you do good things, this is what happens. No, what Jesus is going to say is that actually the Son of Man, the root of David, he's going to come in to save Jerusalem, but not in a way that we think it's going to be. No, Jesus has come to save us from what? It's this thing called sin. It's this thing that corrupts this very nature of human beings. Yes, there's an empire at stake, and there is life at stake. But Jesus sees something bigger, and he sees something different. He sees the world from a different lens, and what he talks about is that there's this very spiritual life that's happening. And way beyond everything that the Israelites are worried about right this very second, there's something even worse that's at hand. And it's actually the very nature and the very corruptedness of the hearts and the lives of humanity. You see what's the actual issue here? It's not that the Israelites, it's not that Jeremiah is saying that they need to be saved from Babylon. It's not that Jesus is saying, hey, I came here to save you from Rome. It's that both instances are talking about this thing of we need to be saved from the nature of us not wanting God at all. There's something going on here in the human heart that says, hey, you're completely away from life itself. You're completely away from God. That's the issue. That's what you need to be saved from. And Jesus does exactly that. He executes justice and righteousness. But how does he do it? He executes justice and righteousness on himself. And so he flips this thing of justice on its head. And so what we think is this whole like, all right, you know, the whole Christian life is based on doing good things or doing bad things. And then those are going to dictate the circumstances. No. What Jesus is going to say is that I executed justice. I did the righteousness. I took everything into my own hands. And what I'm going to do with justice is actually the bad don't get the bad. Do you see that? What people are owed is death. The consequences of sin is death, but justice to Jesus is, okay, everybody gets the chance at life, no matter what's happened. There is no justice. There is no retribution here. It's the fact of, I'm going to make it so that the good people get good, and the bad people get good. And so then it's just like, well, what consequences or like what actions are need to be taken? And that's the issue. That's the issue. We strive so much on how to follow God. When what does Jeremiah say? This is the cool part. You ready? This is where it all comes together. This is the cool part. Verse 16 of Jeremiah. What will the people say? The Lord is our righteousness. He is righteousness. So how do we close? What does this actually mean for us? Is that the people thought that Jesus would save them from Rome. When in turn, he says you need saving from a lot deeper sense. And so there's this power that actually keeps you away from God. You see, when sin entered the world, it divided us from God. And the issue is that God created everything, and God is life. And when Adam and Eve were eating from the tree of life, they had life. And so this tree of life represents God. God is life. And so what sin did is sin gave this obstacle, this barrier, and put it in between God. It's like being a perfectly good light bulb. And God is this full electric outlet, but the plug's not in. Sin unplugged that. So you've got a perfectly good light bulb capable of producing the light from the electricity of the outlet, but yet sin cuts that off. And so there's this barrier, and Jesus is going to say, there's life at stake, yeah, and there's a lot of pressures and things that are attacking your lives right now, especially Rome, but what's even deeper than that is that you don't actually have life because you've been cut off from this nature of sin that tells you that you're good without God, but I came back to say you're not good without God. And though Babylon is coming back, or is coming over to destroy Jerusalem in Jeremiah's time, Jeremiah doesn't say, hey, Babylon's coming in and God's going to destroy them. Don't worry. Just ask God to save you from them. No, what he's saying is, before any of that, come back to God for your sake. Because it's in God that you have life. It's not from Babylon that you need to fear. It's something deeper. It's something bigger. It's being away from God is what you have to fear. And so Jesus' message is that we're all hopelessly lost in this thing of sin that we've been born into, but he executed justice and righteousness himself so that we might be able to see life again. Now, that's for people who haven't come to see who Jesus is yet. Now, there's a group of us in here that are in this other spot where we are so dang stuck in this similar, it's just as much sin. It's this idea that I have to be righteous myself so that I might be the righteousness of God. And that's the Christian life that we fall into. It's this idea that Jesus gave me grace to be free from sin and free from striving to earn God's love and earn God's favor. But then it's also mixed with this idea that I still need to follow the law. I still need to do good things. I still need to do everything. And it's this idea that we need to add to the righteousness of God. And the line is not, you can be righteous, or God can make you righteous, or as if you strive and you learn and you read and you keep going and you try to fill your mind with good things so that God might make you righteous. No. It's the line that God is our righteousness. And so there's a line in here that I don't want us to miss. If he is our righteousness, then that means I bring nothing to the table. We bring nothing to the table. I mean, we had to be saved in the first place. We weren't capable of saving ourselves. And so this voice of hope that Jeremiah is saying is that don't you worry. God is going to save you. God is going to protect you. He's going to discipline. He's going to guide you. But The Christian life, the life of following God, is not, I'm going to try and do what I can to get to him. No, it's that God executed justice and righteousness on himself so that he might be my own righteousness. That I don't have to worry about what I'm doing and how good I'm doing. It's just simply resting in the fact of God's my righteousness. And if the only thing I did today was wake up and have a bowl of cereal and sat at my table with God and just thanked God for being him and working in my life, is that enough? Would that be enough for us? For me, not always. Because I'm always focused on, all right, I got to make sure my heart's being patient, or I got to do these things, or Jesus told us not to be angry.